Right, so good evening everyone. My name is Daniel Faas. I'm the head of the Department of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you all to another TCD-UCD Sociology Public Lecture Series. I would like to extend a very warm welcome and thanks to my co-organizers of this series, Professor Sinisa Malisevic from UCD and Dr. Diane Payne, and Mark Linnane, of course, for filming the event for us tonight. Just a few housekeeping rules as always. First of all, ensure that your mobile phones are switched off, please, and locate the emergency exits on both sides of the hall as you came in. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Neil Flickstein, for tonight, let me flag up that the next event in this series will take place on Wednesday, the 27th of April at 7 p.m. when we are joined by Professor John Hall from McGill University in Montreal, who will speak about the importance of being civil. Invitations will be circulated to all of you via our mailing lists. And as always, you can watch the recordings of all of the events in the TCD-UCD Sociology Public Lecture Series by going to the YouTube channel, which carries the same name. But our main speaker for tonight is Professor Neil Flickstein. Neil is the class of 1939 Chancellor's Professor in the Department of Sociology at UC Berkeley. He has made research contributions to the fields of economic sociology, organizational theory, and social stratification. He's the author of 7 books, including The Transformation of Corporate Control, The Architecture of Markets, Euroclash, the EU, European Identity and the Future, and A Theory of Fields. He's currently working on a book about the financial crisis. Neil has been studying various aspects of European economic, social, and political integration for the past 2 decades. He's done extensive work showing how the European political project changed the way that businesses operate and have expanded markets across Europe. He's also done work on who is a European and how that reflects patterns of social interactions of people across EU member states. His work shows how this plays into a highly limited and contested European politics. I'm proud and honored that you're here with us tonight, and we also have the pleasure of having you guest lecture on the Department of Sociology's MPhil in Race, Ethnicity, Conflict tomorrow morning, followed by an interview with the Irish Times on the topic of your talk tonight, which is European Identities and Politics in the Wake of the Financial Crisis. Professor Flickstein will speak for about 50 minutes or so, and that will be followed, as you are used by now if you are a regular of our lecture series, by a 30-minute question and answer session where all of you can engage with Neil on this really exciting topic. But for now, please give a very warm welcome to Professor Neil Flickstein.
So let me make sure I'm turned on, right? Great. Okay. So thank you for inviting me. Tonight what I want to do is talk a little bit about how the financial crisis has played out across Europe and the kind of effect it's had on European politics. And I'm going to focus on the question of European identities. And one of the things that I think people think in Europe is that a European identity isn't a very important thing. And, but it actually is quite important to the kind of politics that are going on. And let me give you some illustrations of this. So since the financial crisis, we've had a set of European politics which are directed at European level actors from people across Europe and in the different member states. So this one this is a picture of a demonstration in Brussels in 2012, where you can see the message, Europe governed by wolves, owned by pigs. This is from last year, and this is from a UKIP rally. And here, the basic message that this political party has is Cameron, 100% cast iron EU man. And so it's casting him as not British, because there's the British flag, and as European. Last summer in Greece, I think it's really easy to already forget what happened last summer in Greece. But last summer in Greece, there was a set of very, very dramatic events that unfolded. This is from one of the demonstrations in June last year. And here we can see the sign is Frau Merkel, get out, doesn't need much interpretation. And last summer and fall, we have a set of other new kinds of rallies, this one in Stockholm. And this is an anti-immigrant rally, and I think you can see the sentiment of their message. And finally, another one from Amsterdam. Now, what's interesting about these slides? Why am I kind of entertaining you with them for a minute? Well, the really interesting thing is they're all in English. And here we have, across Europe, essentially demonstrations where the signs in the demonstrations are oriented towards the other European countries, and since English is the lingua franca of the EU, it means that when this gets played across the EU, people can read it, they understand what's going on. And this is a characteristic of a lot of this kind of discourse. And so the way we see a lot of political conflict being played out across the EU is as people in different of the member state countries push their national agenda versus this other agenda which is being foisted on them. So in this way, there is a European politics. It's not the European politics that some of the people who created the European Union imagined would happen, but it's a European politics, if you can see it that way. Oh, and then here's another one. I added a couple more this morning. This one's from London. I want to leave the European Union to you. And finally, I found this one. This is from a long time ago. I'm in Ireland, so I should have something about Ireland. Irish fishermen welcome Mr. Sarkozy. This one's been a long time ago. What price? Europe. 20% of EU waters catch 4% of the fish. So again, you can see this kind of engagement in protests with Europeans, the European Union. So I want to kind of raise the question in the following kind of way. You know, the European economic project has succeeded. Europe is functionally a single market, I think. For big hunks of Europe, there's a single currency. Today I experienced that there isn't Schengen everywhere, but it's in quite a few places. And in spite of all of this success, there's been no demand for political integration from European citizens. And since the financial crisis, in fact, people appear to want less Europe. They want their governments to participate less and to protect citizens more. And I think the question I want to try to raise tonight is, why is this? How do we understand this kind of move away? And I want to put it out there. I mean, I wrote this book called Euroclash, which was published in 2008. And at the time I wrote it, I think a lot of, political scientists in particular didn't think European identity was a very important thing. And they didn't think that national identity was a very important thing. But I think what the last 8 years have shown us is that, in fact, identity matters a lot. And that a lot of the politics that have evolved across Europe are really about identity. So the three reasons I think that this makes sense, that we're having this pull away, first of all, of course, is there aren't very many people in Europe who feel European. And I'll give you some numbers on that in a few minutes. The second reason, and I think this is equally as important as the first, is that most of the people who do feel European are from privileged socioeconomic groups. And what this means is that citizens who are less well off, who tend not to be European, who tend to mostly have national identities, want their governments to maintain high levels of social protection. And citizens who feel more European, as we'll see also, are concentrated in some countries, and that makes cooperation more difficult. And I think if you appreciate these facts about the way European identity exists in Europe, I think it forms the backdrop to the kind of politics that we observe in all those slides those pictures I was showing you a minute ago. I think these set of facts explain a lot of the kind of political turmoil that's going on in European cooperation. I think that people who don't feel European or don't think themselves as European are suspicious of the EU. They think that EU cooperation will lead to more austerity if they're on the part that doesn't like austerity, or more reduction in state sovereignty. And sort of at the core of this, and I'll talk a little more about this, are middle-class Europeans who are situational Europeans, and they are feeling more national. And it's them who sort of moved this conversation, I think, is that, and I'll show you some evidence for this in a little bit. So I think the really remarkable thing, and the results I'm going to present to you tonight, I do have the tables with me, but I promise not to discuss regression tables, but I'll be happy to if somebody would like me to. The really interesting thing is that the financial crisis has actually shifted people's identities in survey data. In many of the core Eurozone countries, like France, Italy, and to a lesser degree Germany, identification with Europe has declined substantially as a result of the financial crisis. This means there's even less support for increased European cooperation. Now, I think that this creates a problem because I think that the people who run the governments understand that if they don't develop collective solutions to some of these problems, they're not really going to be able to solve them. And I think that, for example, the struggles over the European Central Bank and over restructuring the banking system across Europe show how hard this is. Here's a very technical, arcane set of issues, what would make total sense is to create a single banking system across Europe in the sense of it'd be easier to regulate, it'd be easier to control all of the things that happened before that weren't so good. But it can't happen. It can't happen because people don't want it to happen. And if governments find themselves engaging in these kind of collective projects that will produce more Europe, then they will find themselves, kind of out of a job. And I think politicians have found this as a kind of difficult situation and they've struggled to respond. And that's why we've observed in the last couple of years, they get together, they have these meetings, they try to paper it over, nothing comes out of it. And the reason is that the heads of the governments who are democratically elected, respond to their public opinion polls. And their public opinion polls say not to do some certain kinds of things. And so the obvious kinds of solutions to a lot of these problems don't happen. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. And this is kind of where I want to end up, actually, is to talk about this. So let me give you the structure of what I'm going to do. That was kind of my quick introduction. Is I want to talk a little bit more about the way the EU works and the central role of national governments. I do want to speak a little bit about what national identities mean, and I want to talk and what a European identity would mean. Here I want to invoke the work of Karl Deutsch. Karl Deutsch was a very famous German political scientist who lived in America, who wrote in the 50s and 60s and wrote some very, very interesting things about nationalism. Then I want to go ahead and show you a little bit about who the Europeans are and why they're so stratified by class. And then I want to talk about how the crisis has affected people's identities and come back around and say a few more things about the way things look going forward. So that's going to be the structure. So let me just say, states matter in Europe because the politics of each of the nation states is really at the core of what's going on. Citizens vote for political parties that serve their interess. Parties seek out political positions that will bring them to power. Almost all the important politics in Europe, that is the public politics, occur within the nation states. European Parliament, they've been, people have tried to make the European Parliament to a real parliament for 30 years and it fails for lots of different reasons. It's not really, doesn't really function as a real parliament. And I do think that people mostly look to their national governments, and that's going to consistently be true going forward. Now, what this sort of means, I think, is that we have democracies, and what it means is that politicians who want to win have to take positions that are going to get them enough votes that they're going to be able to win. And this important fact, I think, explains some of the kind of dynamics I'll talk about in a minute. The future of European cooperation, I'll go ahead and say this, will depend on how much cooperation the people in each country decide they want. And this, in turn, will depend on their interests and identities, and I see those things as being mixed together. And the question of what would make people more European or think that there should be more cooperation, and what people should say would prevent them from doing so is, I think, the basic question. I think this is the question that has to be answered. The future of Europe depends on how these questions come out. And if people see that people in other societies are like them and want to cooperate with them, then one set of outcomes might occur. If people see that people in other societies aren't like them and don't want to cooperate with them, obviously the opposite will occur. And I think when people look at the EU, they sometimes think it's all top-down and there's this big, giant elite-driven project, and it is, but the elite-driven project is incredibly sensitive to these national public interests and these national public identities. And at this point, you know, I'll talk through this a little bit more. So I have a crowd of sociologists, so I don't have to talk too much about group identities. I think the issue of identities in general feeds into the issue of national identities. People share some sense that they are the same in a certain kind of way. They have a shared fate. They have a shared set of beliefs. And what causes people to share identities? Well, in our theories about this, we mentioned three things. First of all, patterns of social interaction, that people interact with other people who they think or come to learn or like them. Relationships, that is to say that ongoing interactions with people who they feel are like them. And finally, differences between us and them. So we're the A's and you're the B's. And because you're the B's and we're the A's, we don't like you, but we like us. And I only hang out with A's and interact with A's, and you only hang out with B's and interact with B's. And this sort of is a kind of social psychology of identity formation and group formation that I think at this point is pretty much widely accepted. What about national identity? As I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about Karl Deutsch. Deutsch has this great book, which is, what's it called? National Identity and Social Communication. So Deutsch has this interesting idea about what a national identity is. And what he thinks a national identity is a kind of cultural story that produces cross-class alliances of a group of people who live in a geographic area, which then creates a polity. And the really important part of this is the cross-class alliance. Because nationalism becomes one of the things that brings together people from different social classes. It makes them all the same. And he also had a couple of other ideas which go back to what I was just talking about our theories of identity, which is that nationalism is the outcome of people interacting with each other and thereby identifying and consuming a common culture. So he was very interested back in the 1950s in what kind of popular culture existed, how people learned about things, music, traditions, etc. He saw media as important in the formation of national identities, and you know, this kind of conception makes a lot of sense. How do you Benedict Anderson, who later wrote this book, Imagined Communities, was influenced heavily by Deutsch and makes a very Deutschian kind of argument in his book. If you recognize what I just said, you'll recognize Anderson's book too. And I think this focus on interaction and culture is really, really, really important. So how would this apply to Europe? If we were going to have a European identity, what would it look like? Well, obviously, if we're following Deutsch, we'd say, well, to get Europeans, we got to have people interact with other people from other societies in Europe. First condition. If you want the Germans and the French to come together and think of themselves as Europeans, they got to spend time together and decide, gee, you know, you're not so bad and we're all alike, if you follow that. And then for such nationalism to evolve, there'd have to be cross-class interactions across societies. And this would mean that not only would you know, people go on vacation in nice places and see each other, but we'd find people of different social classes finding each other and talking and being part of each other. And then there would also have to be common cultural discourses. They'd have to have ways that people were thinking the same things, having the same attitudes. And there's been a kind of, there is a kind of interesting literature about what being a European means. And obviously, that itself is a cultural discourse. Though mostly it's a cultural discourse of a particular class, and I'll get to that in a second. But for such a thing to happen, we'd have to create a story, it'd have to be this way, and you'd have to create these kind of discourses. And I think this is a pretty high bar, most of you can say, and we know that this hasn't happened, right? I think we all kind of know that hasn't happened. But what has happened? Well, I'm going to talk about the survey data, and I'm going to mostly talk about survey data today. I will tell one little story, which I remember the first time I met somebody who was a European. And this was like, oh gosh, this was a long time ago. This must have, I didn't want to date myself. This was a long time ago. And I was at a conference in Luxembourg, and we're out to dinner with some people. And I was sitting next to someone who was a financial economist, and he was German. And he had been in Brussels for a couple years. He had a PhD. And then gone to Paris, where he was helping advise, so you'll see how long ago this was, the French central bank about how to become like the Bundesbank. And in doing so, he'd also gotten to be a little bit of a minor celebrity because he was writing in Le Monde Diplomatique, which sort of made him a small-level public intellectual. And his whole conversation to me that night was how he didn't really want to go back to Germany when this gig was up, and he really wanted to stay in Paris. After talking to him, and he wants to be a European. He wants to be a Cosmo, right? You guys can figure out who this guy was, or something like who this person was like. So when we do surveys, we actually have questions that ask people this question: do you ever think of yourself as a European? And about 10% of the people in Europe do. Now you can say that's a small number or a large number. If we take the fact that there's 350 million people who live in Europe and we just take 10%, that's roughly 35 million. That's a lot of people. I assume some of you know people who think of themselves as Europeans. You might think of yourself as a European and Irish. You might think of yourself only as a European. You might think of yourself as Irish and European. Well, we'll get to that in a second. 46% of people across Europe have only a national identity, and this is in 2004, and about 41% think of themselves as having a national identity and a European identity. This sense of being a European is very much related to social patterns of social interaction. It's very much related to people who travel, people who use second languages. These are the people who interact with other people who are from different parts of Europe and who identify with Europe. And what the data shows, and this has kind of been reproduced multiple times, is that there's really a heavy social class bias to this. So people who are college educated, people who are owners, managers, professionals, or white collar, people of higher income are all more likely to be European. People on the political left versus the right are more likely to be European. There is a gender gap. Women are less likely to be European than men. That's an interesting question with that, why that is. And there's an age gap. Young people are more likely to be European than old. So why is this the case? And I think, coming back to Deutsch, who has the opportunity to travel around Europe, enjoy it, interact with people? And obviously, having the kind of job, the kind of income to do this is going to put you into these kinds of situations. People who travel for their work tend to be higher education, higher income, and obviously higher up in their firms. The young travel more and are more European. So what does this mean about the Deutschian hypothesis? And I think it means that obviously a kind of European identity has emerged because of these interactional patterns, but it's not based on a cross-class alliance, and instead really has a kind of middle and upper middle class basis. And I think that this fact is kind of one of the more interesting aspects of all of this. I don't know if I have a slide about this, but let me riff on that for a second. I think that what this means is that that there have been winners and losers, obviously, in the European project. And there's a really interesting paper that Jason Beckfield wrote about 10 years ago, looking at growing inequality in European societies, income inequality, where he shows that the actions of the EU might account for as much as half of the change in inequality across European societies. And obviously, people who recognize that fact, that European integration has created winners and losers, that's going to have a kind of identity effect, right? The winners, the ones who are interacting across borders, who are finding themselves in interesting situations in all kinds of different ways, are going to, like Europe, it's all going to be kind of a virtuous circle, if you think. The people who haven't benefited from this are going to be skeptical about it, and it's going to reinforce their sense of having a national identity. And the reality is that they have lost. The inequality has increased across most European societies, and to some degree because of the single market project. So how does all this matter for politics? Well, what it means is that within each country, European politics will be to some degree class politics. And as I say, generally it's working class and elderly voters are not for more European cooperation. And this more highly educated, very mobile, 10, 15, 20% of the population, let's call them the upper middle class since nobody likes to be called upper class, are really the Europeans. And then we have in the middle this kind of situational Europeans, people that are middle class voters who, situational is a term I think that Thomas Risse uses in his book, that they move from issue to issue. So they think of themselves as, say, Irish and European. So on certain things they see themselves as Irish. On other issues they might be more European. They go back and forth depending on what the issue is. And this makes those voters swing voters. Depending on what the issue is at hand, you could build a coalition for more European integration in a particular society or against it. And let me show you, whoops, is that where I wanted to go? Yeah. So let me show you how this gets spread across countries. So if we, maybe you've seen these kind of things before. So these are a survey question about, are you only a national identity? Do you have a national or European identity? A European or a national, so you can flip it over, and a European identity only. And this is probably hard to read, so let me point out some of the highlights. This table is arrayed in a way that on one end are the people who have the strongest national identities, and those are people in Great Britain, not surprisingly. And on the other end are people who have the weakest national identities, excuse me, and those are people in Luxembourg, Italy, France, Spain, and Germany. And if you look at that, and then you can see even Belgium, it's under 40%, so I guess let me just stop at 40%. You can see that a lot of the original countries that made up the EU6 at the beginning are in that number. You can tell a good story about Spain. If somebody wants to ask me a question about that, I'm happy to talk about that. But you can see that you've got majorities, big majorities in some of these countries where people are seeing themselves as having some European identity. If we look at the Europeans, European and national is somewhere between about 7%, and there's only about 3% of the people across all the societies who see themselves as only Europeans. So there's about 10%, that's where you get that 10% number. And if you add that, so let's take a place like France, for example. If you look at, I think it's about 8% are European and national, about 6% are European only, that's 14. I add 14 to the national and European, which is at about, 55%. So about 70% of the people in France sometimes think of themselves as Europeans. Following me there? That's a lot, right? And if the right issue comes up and it's a European thing, the French can be counted on to be good Europeans. Now, of course, there's that big giant swing group, that group that's national and European. If the issue cuts the other way, we can take that, about 55% and flip them over. And if we flip them over, then only 14% of the people are European. Everybody see that? And so those swing groups matter a lot for how politics play out in terms of identity. Let me go ahead. I wanted to put Ireland up here since I'm in Ireland. This comes from the Eurobarometer. This is something, maybe some of you know this already or you don't, but for a long time in Ireland, national identity is pretty strong in Ireland. But in 2004, actually, there was, in one of the measurements, in Ireland, the majority of people at that point were saying they sometimes thought of themselves as European. But in the wake of this crisis, this has dropped dramatically, and Irish national identity has shot up. Now, I follow your politics a little, not entirely, but I think this is consistent, right, with the kind of things that are going on in Ireland, this kind of movement. Now, how do politicians respond to this? And I think that this kind of produces a kind of complicated national politics. Look, people want to get elected. That's what politicians want. And so what they're trying to do is build political coalitions that are big and broad enough to get them power. And parties have experimented with anti-EU stands, but what's happened over time is that center-left and center-right parties have converged on a pro-European stance. Now, one of the questions you can ask is, why is that? And usually the answer people give is, well, these people are a bunch of elites and they don't want to pay any attention to people. But the real answer is that this is because for most middle-class voters, situational Europeans, they don't really have an extreme anti-EU position. And being against the EU is actually something that turns some of them off. It's also not something that they always vote on. And what parties have decided, they've shifted their positions over time. What they've realized is that, you just kind of want to leave that one out there. It's not a winner. And instead what we've observed is the parties that have tried to take advantage of this have been left and right parties. And taken these strong EU positions, and they've been able to pick up votes from people who are mostly, who think of themselves only as having national identities, but they're not able to make a great inroad into this middle-class population, at least up until now. And what this kind of does is it sort of explains where we're at today. And I think what happens in Britain in June is going to be very interesting if you kind of follow this kind of theorizing about well, Britain is such an extreme case anyway that maybe since 70% of the people don't ever think of themselves as Europeans, maybe it's so far off the scale that it doesn't matter. But what's happened is that depending on the issue, these things kind of go back and forth, and these identity things move back and forth. I'm going to now show you some. I think that's where I'm going here from here. So what happens in the wake of the financial crisis? Well, in the fall of 2008, when things really fell apart, there was an extraordinary amount of coordination in Europe and between the British Central Bank and the European Central Bank and the American Central Bank. And I've been studying the financial meltdown both in the United States, but as it spread across the world. And the governments were remarkable in coming together to make sure that this didn't turn into the Great Depression. Now, I know you had one here, so or at least something that was pretty bad here. But I just want to say that it could have been way worse. And the amount of coordination was really extraordinary. But, as we moved away from those events where we were saving the banks from the whole financial system collapsing and all the money collapsing and all the ability of anybody to borrow money collapsing to a more kind of normal time, we started to get the kind of discourse about who was on board and who wasn't on board. And this discourse, which developed in the wake of the crisis, so, remember, the crisis hit. We had this deep recession across Europe. We had growing unemployment in many, many countries. And we had this huge financial meltdown in about 5 or 6 countries. And the result of that, after a couple of years, was that the philosophy that went out was this austerity idea. And we can talk about that later. The way that plays out across all of this is that the countries who had this imposed on them, I think the citizens, don't like it. And I think we've seen in country after country, poll after poll, we see attempts by citizens to rally around an alternative position. We see their governments have folded at the end, like the Greeks did last summer in the end, and the most dramatic case of it. But I think citizens have generally seen this in the ones in the countries that are the most negatively affected have said, hey, what about Europe? What about this European project? What about this European identity that we're all supposed to have and that we're all supposed to share and we're all in this together and all that other stuff? Well, obviously, it doesn't apply to us. And I think that the combativeness of politics that's in those pictures that I was showing you really, really reflects this. The German public and the northern countries have tended to view the southern countries as profligate and needing to undergo reformation. This has come across in an incredibly moral tone that stresses that people are irresponsible and you know, it's a pretty heavy set of identity politics. And the people who are on the receiving end of that hear that, and they know that, and they know that's what's being told to them and what's being thought about them. And, you know, going back to Deutsch, you know, it is becoming us versus them. So, you know, I think what's happened is that the countries that were the most negatively affected, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, have had to go it alone without really serious help. They've had this austerity imposed. There's like, again, as I said, there's been this occasional rebellion against it. And I think it's had an effect on the way that citizens in those countries have felt about the European Union and the whole European project. This is in the West. In the East, a very similar thing happened. And I think this has been way less remarked on. But if you go to the former Eastern European countries and see how austerity was applied to them and how their banking systems also underwent almost complete destruction and you know, there was huge levels of changes in unemployment. I think that the same sort of thing happened. I think people saw this and they saw that, hey, you know, there isn't an us here. There's only you and me, and you're on that side and I'm on this side. When you go, and then I think the immigration crisis, which has been going on now for the last year, has also, I think, reinforced this. Citizens in most countries definitely want their governments to stem the flow of immigrants. Immigrants are really unpopular almost everywhere in Europe. They expect their national governments to protect the nation. Politicians have responded. This is an issue that, of course, has gained ground. But what's happened to European identities as this last 7 or 8 years has occurred? And we have done some multivariate analysis where we show that in the countries that were the most economically affected, European identities declined substantially. And I'm going to only present some descriptive stuff, but I'd be happy to talk about the regression analyses that we've done. So just let me give you some descriptive stuff. Slovenia, Bulgaria, Britain, France, Italy, Ireland, Romania are at least 10% more national than they were before the financial crisis. In Britain at this point, 70% of citizens only have a national identity. This is up from about 55% at the beginning of the 2000s. That's a huge change if you think about it. There's been a sea change in Britain. In France, Germany, and Italy, between 43 and 48% of citizens now only have a national identity, up from only 33 to 40%. Let me give you this is an overall thing. Overall, it doesn't look like there's much change. You can see that it went 48%, sometimes Europeans, to 41. But if we look across countries, let me just show you some of this. This is a pattern of that same variable for the UK. Now, the UK was always, so back in 2004, the UK 55%, that was its low point there. And it's been very nationalistic ever since. And at this point, even one of the more interesting things is that there's never really very many Europeans in Britain, about 9%, but now it's down to about 2%. So there's really only about 2% of the people, I mean, if you believe these numbers, and you know, I think they're giving us a sense of magnitude, in the UK who think of themselves as Europeans. And so the next time when you see one of these demonstrations and you read these polls and you hear all this kind of discussion, remember this. This is how people in Britain are thinking about where they're at now. And this surge of nationalism kind of really appears. Same thing happened in Greece. Actually, there's one more wave of this. I should have put it on here. And it's even gotten more nationalistic. The Greeks have felt like they've been written off. If you go to Greece and talk to people, they don't, understand that they had played some important role in what happened to them, but they definitely feel like they're not Europeans anymore. In Ireland, you see, I showed this one before, you can see a similar thing, and obviously you guys got the brunt of financial reorganization. In Italy had always been a place where large majorities of people had thought of themselves as Europeans, and that's the red line here. And if you look, like 13% of the people thought of themselves as Europeans first, and another 60% or so thought of themselves as European, which means, you're up at 73% sometimes think of themselves as European in Italy. Have you ever spent time in Italy? You have a sense of why that is. The Italian state doesn't exist. Anyway, but you can see even in Italy, we see this transformation as a result of the crisis. In France, another place where European identity has always been strong and existing, we see the same kind of thing. And this is a kind of overall view. This is too much data, probably. But you can see a little of what I was talking about. Let me talk through this a little bit. What this has been arrayed by this is the percent in each society who think of themselves only as having a national identity. And this is arrayed by the largest change. So that column, it says change. So in the Czech Republic, it goes from being like about 38% to being like 59% in 5 years. Slovenia, a similar thing. Romania, a similar thing. Ireland, you guys are up there pretty high. Italy's pretty high. France is about the same. And the UK was already high and went up to 72. You can get a feel that there's this kind of sea change happening. And again, in the countries that had the most crisis, you see, generally speaking, the biggest changes. Now, the Greek one doesn't change as much. It changes more in the next round of this because the Greek crisis doesn't really get going until after 2010. And there is another round of this data, and the Greek thing has now moved another 7 or 8 points. But you get a sense of what's happened. So I think this kind of question raises this about why this has happened so quickly and so far. In our analyses, it's very interesting that these effects are really across lots of social groups. But you can see that people who are pensioners, unemployed, less educated, government employees, and blue-collar workers have actually had more movement in their identities towards national identities. They were less European identified before, and now they've become even less identified with Europe. And I think this kind of straightforward thing about the way that this political discourse has been carried on means that people don't think that they're going to be saved, and they're not part of a collective project. And again, for the people who've taken the brunt of this downturn, they were the least European to begin with in the first place. So it's kind of that level, kind of a grim picture. And I think, this comes back to what I was saying before about the importance of the nation states. The nation states are where people live, and they express their grievances, and they express their grievances to their national politicians. And, even in all of this data, only 10% of the people think of themselves mainly as Europeans, which means that most people still have a national identity. And this means that as nationalism has risen, they don't see themselves as being involved in helping their fellow Europeans, but instead making sure their governments take care of them first. And this is intensified as a result of these kind of changes in identity that have happened, I think, in the last 7 or 8 years as an outcome of the crisis. That's really provocative, isn't it? Now, what have politicians done? And I mean, politicians do what politicians do, which is they read political science and know about the median voter. And so they do what their median voters want. At this point, European cooperation isn't very popular. Nobody gets up and says, gee, let's have a currency union or whatever. Nobody wants to say anything like that because they know that's a quick way to become unelected. And so Europeans have quickly softened their position on all this stuff. And as I said earlier, I think that if you talk to people in policy circles, there is a kind of sense in which more coordination would make sense. So let me give an example of this. So in this immigration crisis that's going on, there's sort of three models, right? Every country for itself, put up the borders and don't let anybody in. That's one model that could happen. A second model, I guess, is that people could just kind of muddle through. They could get rid of Schengen and, like I say, build borders, but try to muddle through it. And a third model says, well, why don't we build the wall around the whole of Europe? And why don't we collectively go to Syria and try to solve this problem, and to Turkey and try to solve this problem? And you can see, what are the leaders trying to do? The leaders want to do that. But the question is, who's going to put up the money, right? And if you've been following this kind of negotiation that's been going on with Turkey in the last couple of weeks, everybody, I think, knows that more cooperation here is the way to make this thing go away a little bit, right? I mean, maybe you guys don't believe that. I believe that if the European governments come together and they help control the exterior border, and they can control the refugee crisis and keep people from coming in the first place, and try to help solve the situation in Syria and in Iraq. But they're not doing any of that. They're kind of like they're grasping at straws, and they want to do that, but they haven't been successful. So there's been a proposal on the table that the European governments will give the Turks something like, the last number I saw was $3 billion, which maybe sounds like a lot of money to you, but it doesn't sound like a lot of money to me because I'm used to dealing with trillions of dollars, so $3 billion doesn't sound very much. And basically where that's foundered is that European governments have kind of said, no, we don't want to put any money in. And part of that is they, their citizens don't want them to do it. So here's a kind of clear case where the rational solution would be more Europe, right? But that's not how people are thinking about it, because they're looking back at angry publics who are skeptical about these political cooperation. And anytime anybody starts talking about that, then they kind of back off of it. And this is kind of the situation that I think the governments are in right now. Like I say, while the financial crisis has ended, I'm very close to my conclusion. The past 10 months have brought on new crises, this immigration crisis, and then the terrorist attacks, particularly the ones in France, which were pretty horrible. And this is the kind of point at which I'm going to end. I think, are we in a kind of moment where something really dramatic can happen? Now, one of the things about those identity things is they do move back and forth. So we could tell a story where people become more European, or the situational middle-class Europeans decide that this is a humanitarian crisis and that their governments ought to participate in trying to solve it together. So that's one thing that could happen in the kind of situation we're in with this immigration crisis, more Europe. But the other thing that could happen is that these situational Europeans who've now decreased in number across Europe might end up on the side of the UKIP, in which case the more that happens, then the more likely that the kind of thing starts or continues to unravel, and we get Euroclash. And then my favorite thing, which I always think is going to probably happen, is that they just all muddle through, which is sort of their main tactic of operating in the last 30 or 40 years, is kind of to muddle through. But we are at one of those moments where there is a kind of tipping point. And I want to just leave you with that thought that the situational Europeans the middle classes hold the balance of power on this issue, I think. And depending on where they come down, as we move forward, we're going to find out which way this goes. Are they feeling national, in which case 90% of them can band together in most countries in favor of a national solution? Or are they going to find places where they do have a sense that cooperation is good and we're all in this together in some kind of way? And I think right now, people are feeling pretty nationalist. So you can see where that goes if you follow the prediction. I'll leave you with that sort of depressing thought. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Neil, for the fascinating presentation. Questions? And once you ask a question, keep them brief. We bundle them maybe in threes or so. Do state your affiliation as well. And yeah, we collect three and then ask Neil to respond to them. Anyone?
Neil, thank you very much for that. That was really fascinating. I am pretty cynical about this notion that European identity comes from patterns of social interaction.
Okay.
That in a sense would generate a sense of European identity. I think my money would really be on the processes that we've seen in Europe, particularly since I think the early 1990s, when the use of European structural funds and the penetration, if you like, of European institutions into the individual European societies has become that much greater. So that the very presence of the European institutions can be seen more clearly. And that has led to, particularly in sort of collaboration with the structural funds, a strong sense amongst European nations that the European Union was a good thing. The only places that it didn't tend to look like a good thing often were in the Scandinavian nations, where they saw their very high levels of social provision being watered down. But in most other European countries, the EU was a levelling up process. You know, it was bringing countries like Ireland up to the levels of those Central European states. So by and large, European citizens saw it as a really good thing. We got nice big roads, you know, with lovely tarmac on them. And we got other European institutions that seem to bring higher living standards and a better way of life. I think that's what made us European. And of course, that's what makes us less European when we see that the social cohesion and solidarity that we thought was going to be there when things went wrong wasn't. You know, so that in a sense, the branding only goes so far. And when it comes down to the crunch, when it comes down to where your interests lie, when national politics win out, I think people realise, you know, quite how things really work.
Yeah. Let me make a quip, and then I'll take a serious shot at that. My quip is that you know, the British have been getting this rebate that they think is deserved to them for a long time, I mean, you know, and then they are the ones that have as much or more to lose than anybody if they pull out. You know, from what I see in the business press, for example, every foreign company that's in Britain, because they speak English, is going to come here. You guys are going to do great if this Brexit thing happens. I think the City of London is going to take a big, giant hit. And since that's the only real industry the British have. So from an interest-driven point of view, it's very difficult for me to see that, you know, that integration process that you're talking about, the way in which the British economy has become integrated into the European economy, not the structural funds, they haven't got as many of those because they were in its poor to begin with, but these other kinds of advantages that the British have had, that they don't seem to care about them. And you know, when you look at polls, people discount all of that. And I think it's good. I think it's an incredible disaster for the British economy if they do this. I think it's not going to be a velvet divorce. I don't think that, you know, people care because they are, you know, kind of full of themselves in this identity kind of way. And I think they are in a kind of nationalistic moment. So I'm with you. I agree that I don't think the only story is, maybe I've been pushing my identity story today because that's what I've been pushing. But I don't think it's the only story. But I think it matters what people think. And so, I think, and when you look at people who are, like my apocryphal financial economist, when you look at people who really are part of this cosmopolitan transnational community, are living overseas, have married people from other countries, go to school in other countries, all of these kind of things, you do see that. Now the problem is it's hard to get the causal model right about what's the cause and what's the effect. Were people interested in this, so they went, or or did going change them? This is a big, difficult kind of problem. But we do know that that's where a lot of the hardcore Europeans are those groups that really are part of that kind of community. So I'm with you there. I also think, I think when in Eastern Europe, I think a similar thing happened when they ran as fast as they could away from the Soviet Union, and they were embraced by the European Union, and lots of money was redistributed, and lots of businesses went to Eastern Europe, and then the EU trained lawyers and judges and courts, put in place law which they had none of, Western style law. All those things are really important, those institutional things. But in the face of that, at this point, the Eastern Europeans too have kind of recoiled from all of this, and so I do think it matters how people feel about it. I mean, we're living in America. It's nice not being there. I'm in Paris this year on a sabbatical, but we're living through a kind of the same moment. For the same sort of thing is going on. We're living through a nationalist moment where people have a kind of cultural feeling that they've been screwed, that the real Americans are being screwed, and. I think there's some of that, and I think those things matter, that sense. So I do agree with you that there are other structural conditions that have pulled these things together, but I think you're still being a little overly rationalist for my taste, because I do think that the sense people have of who I am and who other people are, and who my friends are and who my friends aren't. I think those things matter, and they are very visceral in a way that. So let me just choose a crazy American example, because I read too much of the American media. So this Donald Trump fellow is going to probably be the Republican nominee, and the Republicans have been trying to get rid of him. And one of the problems is they think that rational arguments are going to sway people. And what's happened is that people like this guy because they like this guy. They like this guy because he says what they think. And they don't care that he's inconsistent. They don't care that he's been married 3 times. They don't care that he's racist and sexist. They don't care about any of that. He just says what they think, that he doesn't have any policies, that he's not a conservative, that he isn't a cold warrior. They don't care about any of that. And so those kind of arguments that appeal to reason in those kind of situations just don't matter. And I think in Europe at the moment, we're having a little bit of that, not for the whole population, but for big parts of the population in different countries. Like Sweden, for example, and in Denmark too, but more in Sweden, this right-wing party that's emerged in Sweden is really interesting about, I was in Sweden last summer at one point, and people were, couldn't figure it out. They're totally appalled. They can't believe that this is going on in their country. And the academics that I'm talking to, the left-wing academics, are like us, or me. Maybe not you, but me. And it is this other kind of thing that's going on. And I think to not say that cultural identities are important in these kind of contexts. I agree that the structural things are all there, but the way people are feeling about it is something in this kind of gut thing. So it's not very scientific.
So thank you very much. It was a really interesting talk and very, very stimulating. Diane Payne from the School of Sociology. I suppose I just want to come back to the very last point that you were making. I have to admit, when I heard the announcement about providing funding to Turkey of the order of somewhere like 3 billion. My feeling was the same. That will go very, very fast and will really solve nothing. But I was even more shocked by the sudden and rapid move closer to Turkey and the wooing of Turkey in the sense, you can join the European Union and we can accelerate that and we'll forget everything about, your human rights issues and all of that. And so I was actually, as I listened to your talk, I thought, well, maybe the immigration crisis is the savior for Europe, It's the other, But actually,
could be.
Yeah, I mean, we all don't want. Well, I actually think, I don't think there's many people who feel that we all don't want immigrants. I think there's quite a lot of openness across many European countries, and there's still a feeling and a sense of the appreciation of diversity. But on the other hand, it's the chaotic nature that's happening and the inhuman nature that it's being managed. However, I suppose in a long-winded kind of way, I'm just trying to ask the question, what do you make of that certain embracing of Turkey as a member of the European Union? Because it is something that is even more challenging than the embracement of and trying to manage or muddle through with immigrants pouring over the borders. I think it's really an extraordinary step. It's very politically astute, of course, and it's welcome because Greece has been, they've really found Greece's weakness. Greece has really objected the most strongly to allowing the membership of Turkey, and now they've found a perfect way of bringing Turkey on board, and it's a very strategic it will become a strategic member of the European Union. So there's all kinds of things being played off against each other here. I'm just quite curious.
Yeah, no, I think, at the end of the day, are they really going to restart these negotiations, and what does it mean? And, the devil's in the detail on this kind of an agreement this is my muddling through thing. This could go on for 10 more years. It died when Sarkozy killed it the last time, basically. What will happen next? That's what the Turks are angling for at the moment. But I think that there's also been a reaction against providing these funds, whether they're enough or not. So whether the European governments will come to some cooperative arrangement with the Turks, I think that's still up in the air. And it could end up being my slide there about Euroclash versus more Europe, it could go that way. It could, but I think we're at that kind of tipping point where the politicians have to decide something. They have to decide how far can they go, what can they make to their publics as good rational arguments. I think if they go to the point of talking about really admitting Turkey, I do think that could be the line that they can't cross in some way, that they haven't agreed to that yet. And because of you can sort of put together a nationalist argument about why they ought to give the money to the Turks and set up, refugee camps in Turkey. You don't want them here, okay, this is your solution, and you have to tax yourself a little more, and that's what you're going to have to do. So you can make a rationalist, kind of nationalist argument about that. But it might. It could be the thing. I think your original point that it could go either way. I think it could go either way, and I think that just shows how important the kind of framing of these things is, and how they get set up for different political communities within each country, and how different politicians have different kinds of political problems trying to get reelected. That's kind of the needle that they have to thread through, and I could see it going that way, but I can also see that the easy thing to do is to say, we're going to put up the walls, and like what the Hungarians are talking about, and the Poles are talking about, and that's what we're going to do, and that's the easy way. That's the way to go to your nationalists and win some points and make a big deal of it or something. That's the easy way to do that, I think. And I think it's hard to do these other things. And if it happens, then, then they will have once more found their way through something, and they could end up creating more cooperation. But I do think there are lots of black clouds out there.
Please pass the mic to David, just a minute.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Very interesting. Donna Davis, Trinity Sociology. I hope my question isn't kind of rehashing Richard's. I don't think it is, but you can stop me if it is. I'm just wondering.
Maybe I didn't answer.
Sorry?
I said maybe I didn't answer, but go on.
If we look at declining European identity and increasing national identity as an obstacle to finding a solution to Europe's problems, I'm just wondering, is that a bit like mistaking a symptom of the underlying problem for the underlying problem, right? Because surely the data you've presented show that what I mean by the symptom of the problem is that surely this hit that European identity has taken and the increase in national identity is as a result of the crisis or maybe the handling of the crisis, right? So I'm just wondering, is there a kind of tautology there? And then, I mean, part of the reason I ask is that
Good question.
you could still say that even if that's true, you could still say that we are where we are, and we still need to, we have the problems we have, and this is a problem this is an obstacle to finding that solution now. And there is that argument, and there's the argument that the EU needs to be more like the US and to transfer, essentially to transfer payments across the EU. But in a way, that's almost like letting the EU institutions off the hook for the decisions they have made over the course of the crisis, right? Because in a way, it's too easy to say that, oh, well, we can't do anything. The problem is we don't have this imaginary potential United States of Europe. But actually, if you look at the decisions and the choices that they've made in the Eurogroup and in other European institutions over the last, 5-6 years, many of them are highly questionable. And I don't think they can all be explained, or they can be explained away on the basis that, oh, we didn't have more coordination. It's highly questionable decisions about debt relief or debt relief that wasn't done and so on, with a lot of different actors involved. That's it.
Yes. Let me say something a little whimsical, which is that, I believe in a pragmatist theory of action, which means that I think history is always going on and it doesn't end, and we don't get frozen into institutions that never change and all that stuff. The fact that they tend not to is because there's lots of other things underlying institutions, groups who have power, who have interests, who are organized, and it isn't just that we don't think about it very much. And I do think that some decisions that, like of the last, since the crisis, have been problematic. So, I think, for example, no one has really explained, I think, in a cohesive way, why the Germans are so obsessed with this austerity thing. Because it's very weird, because it's bad economics. So you can't say, well, this is globalization and neoliberalism run amok. Because it's not really that. It's actually more a kind of moral kind of sense of, households have to balance their budget, so should the government kind of, stuff, which we have in America too. So I recognize these kinds of arguments. But, the doggedness with which, the German public has supported this and believes this, and it's like, one of the things is I don't know Angela Merkel, but even if she wanted to do something, I don't think she can. I think if she wants to stay where she is, she can't walk away from that at this moment. And her pronouncements seem to think she believes in it, maybe. But, those decisions are sort of hard to explain. And so, hey, what happened here with the banks is another thing that's sort of hard to explain. Like, why did you take the private debt and turn it into public debt in Ireland? And nobody's explained this, as far as I can tell. And I know that people are out there trying to dig into it. And I've heard explanations, somebody just made a decision and flipped the switch and that's what happened. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe if that is what happened, then we all ought to really be kind of worried about the people making the decisions. So I do think that there is room in these things to move. I think And what, I mean, kind of one of the things, going back to my pragmatism thing, is that a lot of what leadership is about framing and the ability to get into other people's heads and help them, come to a certain opinion and try to find enough people who agree with you that you can change the course of the way a decision is going. And I think that there's not been very much of that since this crisis has started. And so, I mean, to me, that's my kind of, it could go another way. And that's why in the situation that we're in now, if someone can manage to come up with a really good story about how to do this in a way that makes, that kind of appeases different groups of people within different European societies who are very upset about the immigration situation, and help solve the problem and deal with the humanitarian crisis, that's a winner, right? But we don't see anyone out there right now who's got that kind of story. And instead, what we're seeing is everybody is looking at their own pocketbook and I'm willing to go this far, but I'm not willing to go that far. And so we are in that kind of situation I was talking about up here, which is that everybody's back thinking they're in a zero-sum game. Not in a repeated game where there's cooperation and there's bargaining, if you want to use that metaphor. And there's clearly not much of this kind of, like I say, I would call it leadership. And so, can something happen good? I mean, usually what all of our sociological theories tell us is it's in exactly situations like this that something new is possible. But it doesn't have to happen that way. And so I do think we're in a situation where someone could, I mean, there's enough stuff in flux and whatever that someone could potentially organize something different, but I'm not seeing it. And what I am seeing is instead this kind of people going back and reading the public opinion polls and saying, well, this is really unpopular, so I'm not going to support it. And that's kind of part of the dilemma of this nationalization. I want to say something about your point about tautologies. I think that had the crisis gone in a different kind of direction and had the solutions to the crisis been more collectively conceived as opposed to shove down the throats of some countries, I think that that we might not have seen this change in identities. And so coming back to your general point about the mistakes, I think had the ECB and some of these other authorities been able to cobble together a little bit better ideas, that had to be a lot better, but different ideas, and had a different theory about what had to happen. I mean, like for example, in Greece, it's like there's no economist in the world who believes that the Greeks are ever going to pay this money back. And I don't know if any of you have been in Greece, but you go to Greece and you can walk down the street and see that that's not going to happen. It's a third of the storefronts are closed. There's no industry in the country. The whole theory of this is if you drive their wages down enough, all of a sudden all these multinationals are going to show up and start building car plants. It hasn't happened. Yet, it's kind of slipped back and it's not a problem. And so I do think there's been a kind of lack of that kind of thinking. And so I do, I do think it didn't have to go down this way. It doesn't in these crises have to go down these ways. And crises, it's that Rahm Emanuel thing. Crises are an opportunity as well as a challenge. And so I think that this one, the governments have by and large failed. That would be my interpretation. That makes sense.
Okay, may I?
Sure.
Okay, Sinisa Malashevich, UCD Sociology. In nationalism studies, we take much long-term view. So in a sense, this kind of
This is the blip.
yeah, this is sort of, it's not unusual, it's not unexpected, because nationalism never went away. In a sense, it's been there, it's been, for at least 200 years. So I'm thinking, to take you a little bit through theoretical, right? And you focus on Deutsch, which is interesting, and he's sort of quite functionalist, representing his times. But the points that he makes about importance of a class solidarity does stand, I think. But that's one element. In a sense, obviously Gellner's element about high literacy rates and a shared educational system is something that is missing in Europe. Habermas's element about shared public sphere, no there. I mean, obviously, understand you mentioned media, that we share, and printing is still very much nationalized. Mann's point about, military experience. So there's so many other factors that have played part in building nationhood as a phenomenon, as a process, which never really happened in European case, and there was no attempt to do so. So in a sense, you could say that the nationalism and the Europeanism went together. In part, you could say even that the European narrative was framed within the nationalist narrative. So in a sense, something like this will happen inevitably at any point in time, because the European project was first and foremost an economic project. It was never really a cultural project. It was a political project to some extent, but not deeply so internally, more externally. So in a sense, I think that that kind of the broader historical frame would help make a stronger case. I mean, that's how I would see it.
Yeah. Well, let me say something whimsical, since I'm into saying whimsical things today. Is that the other, if you take a long enough historical view, is that this has only been going on for 50 years, right? And the national identities took hundreds of years, and of course still evolve, and they're not dead, they're evolving. So maybe another thing is this could be, maybe the problem is we're being myopic, or I'm being myopic, and if we take a long enough historical understanding of this, 50 years from now, all of these kind of interdependencies will grow more, and there will be more European integration or European identity. So that's what some people have argued, right? But I think here's where I do think that there has been some attempt to try to build the European identity on the part of the Commission and the Council and the way that they've operated, and they've particularly been really good at co-opting intellectuals. And I mean, I don't know how many of you get money from the EU, but the EU is like the big, in social science, the big game in town, right? Because your national governments don't spend any money, and so the EU is the one. And then they fund all of these meetings and agencies and all this kind of traveling. I mean, if I was to say the thing that's changed the most since I've been studying Europe is that the frequency of interaction between academics has increased like exponentially, which is part of Gellner's argument, right? And I think that that's created one of the backbones of the possibility for something that's more European, because then it affects education, and it affects the way what people are taught about the national narratives and the place of France in, just picking on a country, in Europe, and how to read French events in that kind of way. So I think that those things are Deutschian and out there too. I just don't think that you can overcome this social class thing, and I think that that at this point that's where I think it works perfect for the upper middle classes who.
Early 19th century nationalism was a middle class phenomenon.
Yeah, that's true. No, that's true. But then we had the First World War, right? So that was kind of a bummer. So, yeah. No, I think there's some truth to that. But I don't know. I mean, it's a good question as to how far it can go, and can it expand out? And I do think there's top-down, bottom-up things going on too. So some of it's top-down, some of it's bottom-up. And there's in your class I have a whole chapter about media, and it's interesting because there's a lot of European media. And for example, I did a kind of an analysis of popular songs and music. Books are clearly still national. People read, and there are only a few books that cross national borders. And at the time I was working, Harry Potter was one of them. one of the things that cross national borders. But music turns out to be, pretty. There's still a local vernacular in music, where in the popular music, but there's also a lot of European music or music that crosses. And then in terms of media, well, of course, the dominance of the American film and television industry means that Europeans are watching American films and television a lot, like half of what they watch is American in that way. I'm not sure what effect that has on people, but it's some of it. So the cultural, those things have, it's possible. The other thing is if people want that information. In the business communities, there are, like business publications that operate this way, like the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal Europe, operate as instruments where executives find out about what's going on in other places. So they still read their national business newspapers as well. So I think some of that cultural stuff is going on. And I do think, I don't know, the Habermas thing about the public sphere, I don't think that exists in any country anyway. So does that exist in Ireland? Does a public sphere in a Habermasian sense? I don't know. It doesn't exist in the United States. I can tell you for sure that we don't have that kind of public sphere.
Or in a narrow sense of sort of debates.
Yeah, but I think those debates are going on, and I think that when European issues, there have been some interesting people have done interesting work looking at how different issues which catch on in different countries get portrayed in different presses. And there is this speaking to each other. And my point about the English thing is really strong, that if you watch demonstrations around Europe, when they're not just focused on the national governments, which still 70% or 80% are, they are in English and they are being focused on. So, in that sense, there is a European politics. It's just a really contentious politics. And it's one where the nations have become more ferocious. There isn't an arena there. It's not a Habermasian arena. It's more of a Darwinian kind of thing. But it's. I definitely think it's there. I don't think people are ignorant. There was this great study by I'm repressing on his name. I think he's Dutch, and I'm repressing on it. Anyway, there's a great study of just looking at newspapers and how many articles on the front page of newspapers, the main newspapers in countries, have European content to them, and it's really high. Look at on the average day of your average newspaper, it's very high, the kind of the way events get reported. I remember, let me just give you another example of that kind of thing, is that when Hollande got elected, what did he do the next day? He went to Germany and talked to Merkel. I can't imagine, would an American president go to Canada or Mexico? No. And that he felt compelled the next day to go talk to Merkel, And I don't know, this whole thing that David Cameron kind of got this fig leaf, it's an interest. We're never going to know what really happened there, right? When they all got together and made up this story about what the Brits were going to get for staying in. But my guess, I can imagine it looks a lot like a Habermasian kind of, you got to give me this, boys, kind of thing, or, you got to give me something here. And so you can see those kind of political processes. So I think there is a European politics. I just don't think it's one that most social scientists like. And it's not very democratic, and the level of there isn't a place where that's going on, but there is this conversation going on, and you can follow it.
Neil, you mentioned early on in the presentation that travel, language, and also class are enablers for European identity. Now I wonder, based on some of my own research, a survey among British and German 15-year-olds in schools, where I gave them a geopolitical map of Europe, and I asked them to locate 10 countries on that map. In the UK, regardless of class, about 3/4 of the sample were only able to find their own country, whereas in Germany, maybe not surprisingly, the same number, about 3/4, were able to correctly locate six or seven countries out of the 10 correctly on that geopolitical map. Now, that arguably has to do with the amount of European topics infiltrated in the curriculum, say in social science subjects, geography, and so on and so forth. So if we're talking about more Europe, and if the EU wants to have more of a European identity, more European knowledge, and knowledge is kind of a pre-stage to identity in many ways, what is the role then of the education system and education policy making in particular in enabling that, and maybe also addressing that in the current times across a range of European countries?
Yeah, I can't help but make this comment, which is that I think that half the Republican presidential candidates who were all in favor of bombing ISIS didn't know where ISIS was. So I don't think this is just high school students. You said high school students. Yeah. Anyway, I think that the higher education systems have become more, they haven't become totally integrated, but I think this Bologna process thing has made some difference. I do think, I haven't seen any, when people study it, the whole system, I haven't seen anybody, maybe somebody has done this and I don't know, but I think it would be quite fascinating to look at the degree to which the European university systems have become more outward-looking rather than inward-looking. And you see a lot of that in Germany. I remember when I first started going to German universities, you could be someplace and go 50 miles down the road, and people didn't even know who each other were, and because they were so self-centered. And now I think that's pretty impossible. And there are, there's something called the European Sociological Association, right? Or is that what it's called, the association? Which which didn't exist, 30 years ago. And so you do get these. And this isn't just in sociology. I think it's across a lot of disciplines, and even there's European associations for almost every profession that exists. So I do think that this kind of outward looking of the education system and the higher education system has happened. The Bologna process thing is more complicated. I think a lot of the interesting part about that is that different governments were trying to get different outcomes and trying to use the EU to beat down their systems. That's what was going on in France, and I don't think it's actually worked as well as they thought. At least in France, it hasn't worked as well as people expected it to or wanted it to. But it certainly had some. It was a weird idea because I don't know if you guys know this, but only 2 or 3% of undergraduates actually go to other universities in Europe to spend a semester, and it's very, very tiny. But the idea that you have to make all the degrees the same so that when those people do that the classes are the same or they count the same is a kind of. I thought when it was going on, I thought it was an amazing kind of. Why would anybody do this kind of thing? And then many people in many countries experienced it in a really negative way. I don't know how much it played out around here, but I had people complain about it, randomly to me about, God, why do we have to do this? But I do think higher education is a place that has really operated that way, that there has been an internationalization of the academy in Europe. And then you can see it in look at your faculties. The faculties, well, here you are, you're here, right? And there has been an internationalization. I'm actually sitting on a recruitment committee at Sciences Po, and I think we got 50 applicants for this job, and 2/3 of them are not French, or 3/4 of them are not French. And we'll see how it turns out. But that's in one of the places where it's always been difficult for outsiders to get in. So I do think I think that it's happening. It's not happening really fast, but it is happening. And I do think it has effects. I do think it creates this sense of people being together. And there is, it does, I think, come down to students. There's been some work done on curriculum and how curriculums have changed. And the most way it's changed in the high school level is to see the country's narrative history in the context of the other countries. So instead of just teaching French history, you teach France in Europe. And so a lot of it then becomes about their relations to the other groups, and so, I definitely think that's an improvement if 3/4 of them can place all of those. I'm sure American high school students couldn't do it either. And then the fact that the British ones can, I mean, I think the British are really, at this point, have isolated themselves in a way that even if they leave the EU and their economy undergoes a 20% collapse, I just think that's kind of where they're at, you know, where people are at. And, you know, I don't, so I think you have to look more at the sort of core countries where I think you are seeing these, you know, these kind of things going on like we're talking about with higher ed.
And just like one more question.
First of all, thanks very much for the presentation tonight, Kyle Sweeney, undergraduate. So something that's just always really struck me about the EU that differs it from, like, say, the World Trade Organization is that individual member states can't retaliate against another one in terms of trade, whereas that seems to be kind of undermined by the fact that the ECB attaches such stringent conditions to how its money spent whenever it distributes it, sort of like it's holding back from becoming like another person asking a question, raising a deal with the United States of Europe. So, like, my question, I guess, is, like, do you think that was a deliberate thing when the EU was being created as sort of a check and balancing, or do you think it was just sort of an oversight because both of them have caused a lot of trouble in the financial crash and its aftermath?
Yeah, that's like, you know, that's one of those, I come back to my pragmatics thing of action thing. You know, Joe Weiler has this great paper that's already probably 25 years old, which is how the court created a legal system, and as an example of what you're talking about. And his argument basically is that the judges didn't know what to do. So they said, well, I don't know what to do. So they threw it to the ECJ. And of course, the ECJ said, hey, this is a chance for us to make a decision. We'll make a decision that, you know, will constitutionalize the treaty. And I like that story. I don't know. It's it fits a lot of my prejudices about the world, but how the world works. But I think I think that the original organizational design of the Treaty of Rome hasn't really changed that much. And I did a paper a long time ago where I was looking at, okay, how is these policy domains of the EU, how have they changed, how has the organization changed? And in fact, it's almost not changed at all. That if you go and you look at the organization of the Director Generals in Brussels, they correspond to parts of the original treaty. And so, they've done some reorganization over time of these things, but that original design is still there. But I think there's been a lot of unintended consequences. So for example, I think the original design was to create a more corporatist structure. And the idea was you'd have the trade unions, you'd have the corporations, and they would operate, and then you'd have the EU. And I think what happened is that Brussels was such a small place that if people had a problem, they would go talk to the person who was in charge of doing something, and they would try to lobby them directly. And so those institutions never got off the ground, the ones that were supposed to organize interests. But I do think a lot of that was built in at the beginning. I think it's also the fact that the case that when you go out and ask people what things should be done at the European level and what shouldn't, when these polls happen, one of the reasons they got into environmental stuff was that polls showed that people thought that was a good idea. Okay, here's something we can do that nobody's going to complain about, and they went into it like gangbusters. They were very, kind of opportunistic in that way. So I do think that the original treaty did limit a lot of this, but I think that if you go back and look at these things, I did think this. People did theorize spillover back in the 50s, and Ernie Haas, knew Jean Monnet, and the reason he wrote that book, which actually is called The Unity of Europe and has a question mark at the end of it, is that he wasn't sure, but he thought that was what would happen, that this process would spill over, and people would say, oh, well, if we're doing this, then we have to do that. And of course, I was being neo-functionalist a little while ago about that myself. Sometimes I lapse into it, I admit. But I do think it hasn't really happened. I think there's been deepening along the things, as you were saying, it's an economic project. There's been deepening in the places where they can deepen, but it hasn't really spread across a lot of these things. So another really interesting place is the reorganization of defense and creating the European Defense Force. It is a totally rational thing to create a European Defense Force. And in fact, I had a student a few years ago who went out and did interviews in France and Germany and Britain and talked to the military people thinking, well, maybe they'd be against this. And they were like, no, we think this is a great idea because it means there'll be more of us and we'll get more guns, you know, we'll have bigger toys. Who do you want to be? Do you want to be the wing commander of the French 47th Wing or the wing commander of the European Defense Force? I want to be the commander of the European Defense Force, right? And actually, the other thing he did is he talked to people in the different foreign ministries, and they had a very similar take on it. That you know, this would be a great thing. We have a foreign policy instrument. We could have a collective. It'd be awesome. But you know, the public, you know, as soon as, boy, I'll tell you, you know, you guys are doing what? And then somebody was talking about being cynical. If Max Weber is right and the purpose of the state is to control the means of violence, if you guys give up the means of violence to some collective entity, what do you guys, you know, what do we need you for? What do we need the national governments for at that point? But anyway, but I think it didn't happen. But there's one that I think the governments, you know, a lot of people thought that was a really great idea. And obviously it kind of hit a wall at a certain point. And I think a lot of the wall was public opinion. I think it wasn't so much the resistance from the entrenched bureaucratic authorities. And it's way off topic, sorry.
Okay, I think this brings us to the end of our evening, but let me thank first of all Neil Flickstein for his really excellent talk and you all for engaging with him. So thanks very much. And don't forget, I hope to see you all again, 27th of April, 7 p.m. in the nearby Davis Theatre. John Hall will be here from McGill in Montreal. So good night and thanks a lot.